Aloha and welcome back to Vox Terra. Today we pose the question, what really happened at COP26, the major international climate conference? And I will be citing from the Sierra Club, Natural Resource Defense Council, as well as EcoWatch. Remember, for environmental issues, it's best to start with the environmental organizations and what do they have to say. I'll be bullet pointing for you agreements from that conference. And this is so important because if you don't have any idea of what's in that agreement, then you are susceptible to what I call fake conspiracy theories, which are aimed at protecting business as usual, specifically fossil fuels petrochemical use, but present themselves as standing up to a status quo when they are not. Or, number two, you might get the wrong idea that there is a they watching over us, that there is a they weighing out the evidence and taking appropriate measures, and that things are under control. So knowing what's in it, number three, provides you with a framework that you can use as an activist, as an average citizen, to hold people accountable to. So to help us, I'll break COP26 down to three main categories. Category one, I'm calling fossil fuels, vehicles, and cleaner energy. Starting with zero-emission vehicles. German professor comes out. More than 100 governments, fleet owners, and manufacturers pledged to only sell zero-emission vehicles, targeting 2040 globally and 2035 in key markets. Notably, 3 United States also joined the pledge, those being New York, California, and Washington State. Now, please note for your own understanding of real politics, these 3 states are all democratically dominated. Major auto manufacturers Ford, General Motors, and Volvo also joined. But notably, Toyota, Volkswagen, Japan, China, and the United States did not sign. And the Natural Resource Defense Council points out that in these here United States, transportation is still the biggest slice of greenhouse gas emissions. So getting those gas guzzlers and engine idlers off the road and parking lots is key to staving off climate crisis. Then there's the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. COP26 saw the first international coalition of countries committed to ending oil and gas extraction, led by Costa Rica, Denmark, and joined by France, Greenland, Ireland, Sweden, and Wales, as well as the Canadian province of Quebec, or Quebec. Note again, California, as well as New Zealand, joined as associate members, and these signatories agreed to stop approving new oil and gas exploration and production, as well as set end dates to end current production. But the United States and Canada opted not to sign, despite the fact that ditching fossil fuels completely this decade remains critical to keeping warming within 1.5 degrees Celsius. 3 more countries joined the Coal Transition Program, which is a program that helps nations transition away from coal or offers financial assistance. Those countries are India, Indonesia, and the Philippines. What's known as the Powering Past Coal Alliance gained another 28 signatories, and that alliance is aimed at transitioning away from coal and towards what they call clean energy. Signatories include Poland, which is Europe's largest coal producer, but notably the United States, India, and China have not signed, which are the world's largest 3 carbon emitters, and the US being the biggest historic emitter of the 3. However, more than 20 countries did, including the United States, as well as financial institutions, agree to stop public financing for overseas fossil fuel projects and instead steers funding towards clean energy projects. Now, the NRDC notes that in 2017 and 2019, through that time period, gas projects received on average of $15.9 billion in international public finance each year. That's 4 times as much as wind or solar. Coal and oil projects follow close behind. Now, this is amazing because if more of the public was aware of this public financing for fossil fuel projects and the lack of public financing for renewable energy, how would these conspiracy theories or fake conspiracy theories that addressing climate change is part of some plot really hold up? A major category being celebrated somewhat is the methane pledges, those led by the United States and the European Union. Now, largely here we're talking about reducing methane leakage from pipelines and oil and gas wells, and they pledge to reduce by 30% by 2030. Now, another source of methane also comes from food scraps and sewage decomposing when they're not being composted. I'd like you to remember that composting is the preferred method for addressing climate pollution when it comes to food and sewage. We feel that addressing methane through energy from sewage and waste can easily lead itself towards greenwashing. The Biden administration, simultaneously with that pledge, also pledged a comprehensive federal government plan to slash methane emissions from oil and gas wells and pipelines by 41 million tons through 2035. Now, please note here that the Trump administration actually weakened methane emission regulations that were put in place under the Obama era. A clean energy highlight is that the United States joined the Indian-led International Solar Alliance. And according to the NRDC, the U.S. has the potential to expand its solar generating capacity by 40 times over the next 30 years, eliminate carbon emissions from the power grid. The power grid is the second biggest generator of greenhouse gases next to transportation, as well as see 1.7 trillion in net economic and health benefits. Remember, cutting back on fossil fuels is not only better for our climate, it's also better for our health. The United States and the European Union also reached a green steel agreement. Now, by green steel, my understanding is it means steel not produced using coal. Category 2, I'm calling business and finance. Now, this is an important category because banks, investment houses really provide the funding for fossil fuel expansion, and it's a lack of oversight and thought in what we could call supply chains that really provides the looking the other way towards deforestation and other environmental devastations. So there was the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. A group of the world's biggest investors, banks, and insurers announced a plan to leverage its $130 trillion in assets to achieve net zero targets by 2050. Now, the NRDC warns that this is going to require oversight to prevent greenwashing and a complete abandonment of fossil fuel funding. Then there is the growing Green Bank Network, which is overseen by the NRDC, as well as something called the Coalition for Green Capital. Now, the idea here is they are leveraging public funds to attract substantially larger amounts of private funds to sponsor greener energy projects in particular. There's something called the First Movers Coalition, which involves 25 large major corporations, Amazon, Apple, and Salesforce, to name a few. Now, they say they will harness their purchasing power towards more sustainable business practices. And I want to point out specific examples because it's these business agreements that will really lend themselves towards what I call the fake conspiracy narrative. So among these pledges are zero-emission steel, electric fleets for heavy-duty trucks, more sustainable jet fuels, as well as looking closer at other supply chain issues. Now, sustainable jet fuels are going to be problematic, but there's really no arguing with green steel or with electric vehicles for your trucks. And all these are really aimed at empowering what I call the more responsible elements within the business community. Now, some would like to dismiss that entire procedure, and they will want to dismiss it for two reasons. One, to sabotage all change, or two, to spur on greater change. But remember, unless you are planning on replacing capitalism, which I don't see anyone planning on doing that, it is extremely important to empower those within the business community who are trying to behave more responsibly. And then for activists and environmentalists to monitor and be vigilant. Now, my third category I'm calling natural solutions and aid. So along with the zero-emission vehicles pledges, the methane pledges, another notable pledge was the deforestation pledges. More than 100 countries, which contain about 85% of what's left of the planet's forests, said they would halt and begin reversing deforestation, as well as land degradation by 2030. Now, this is important because the forests sequester carbon, but they also provide many other ecological benefits, habitat, as well as food sources. And in fact, indeed, doing your agriculture harmoniously with forests does seem to have better outcomes for those crops. And lastly, those large forest reserves provide ways for people to live off of the land, especially the indigenous. Now, these forest pledges also involve financial institutions, that they will better monitor their supply chains to not be purchasing products from very non-sustainable forest practices. But this agreement doesn't set any binding commitments, and it's also open towards greenwashing, as many environmentalists have pointed out. If you clear-cut one forest and plant a new one, that newer, younger forest is not going to provide those same ecological benefits. It can take nearly 100 years for a tree to get up to speed and sequester all that carbon. Well, in addition to promising to protect the forests, there was also a pledge made by Latin American countries, specifically Ecuador, Costa Rica, Colombia, and Panama, announced plans to establish a vast ocean sanctuary, where industrial fishing would be off limits. And this supports what's called the 30 by 30 goal to have 30% of the Earth's surfaces set aside for wilderness protection. Well, and that seems awfully reasonable to me. Now, as far as funding goes, there's an interesting agreement to help fund the indigenous or Native Americans or Native peoples in their efforts to sustain and protect their natural habitats like the forests. And interestingly, underreported in the media, especially the American media, are the indigenous struggles in both the United States and Canada against pipeline development, as well as indigenous struggles in Latin America, where they are trying to protect their forests from exploitation. And in Latin America, sometimes getting murdered in the process, and in the United States and Canada, getting arrested in the process. And more money was earmarked or set aside for what's called climate adaptation projects in least developed countries. So here we're talking about a term you might have heard called loss and damage, meaning the industrialized, so-called wealthy nations are the historic contributors to this climate crisis by just pumping this atmosphere full of carbon and methane and other greenhouse gases historically. And the idea here is that many of the lesser developed countries, especially those closer to the equator, are feeling climate change hardest and fastest. So for some examples of previous help that came to these nations from this fund are training of marine meteorologists on storm surge protection modeling, protecting farmland against soil erosion. And I point those out because, again, there's a lot of fake conspiracy theorists out there who will try to protect business as usual. So here I'm showing you that two specifics, stopping soil erosion and training meteorologists, hardly sounds like big government overreach. Now, lastly, I'd like to wrap up with the fact that both Sierra Club and the Natural Resource Defense Council in their summary articles of COP26 pointed out the importance of youth climate activists, highlighting the fact that despite dozens of conferences, global emissions have continued to rise. And the Glasgow conference took place in the wake of record-breaking storms and flooding in Glasgow. Much of the global south was unable to attend this conference due to COVID-19 restrictions. And the results of the meeting, at least in the words of Greenpeace, was little more than a commitment to meet again. And quite frankly, this COP26 did not secure, quote, a path to achieving global net zero emissions by 2050, nor achieving the goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is what's believed to keep warming under the catastrophic levels. So it's those climate activists, average people like us, taking an interest and speaking up that will help ensure that these agreements are not, as what Greta Thunberg called, only accounting tricks, meaning making it look like you're doing something when you are not, or what many others refer to as greenwashing. So in summation, while this deal does provide furtherance of the goal of limiting fossil fuel production, limiting greenhouse gas emissions, expanding wilderness protections, as well as cleaner energy solutions like wind and solar, it is activism and vigilance that is key to making any of that come about. Well, I hope you found this video super helpful, and if you did, please make sure you're subscribed to my channel. You've clicked that notification bell so you know when I'm putting up another informative video. You're liking, you're commenting, and as always, until next time, peace be with you.